inside the mind of a psychopath, the chilling truth, all right. Let's dive into something that's both chilling and deeply fascinating inside the mind of a psychopath, the chilling truth. Psychopaths, those who seem to walk among us, but play by a completely different set of rules. They might look like us, talk like us, but inside, they see the world in a way that's almost alien. What we're about to explore isn't just about understanding what makes a psychopath tick. It's about understanding what this reveals about us, about the human condition, and about the fine line that separates morality from madness. Let me ask you this: what does it mean to truly be human? For most of us, that question is rooted in empathy, connection, and the ability to care for others. But in the mind of a psychopath, that definition crumbles. Empathy becomes a distant concept, a weakness even. Instead, they live in a world where manipulation, control, and a lack of conscience define their existence. But here's the deeper question: why? Why do psychopaths lack empathy? Why do they approach life as a game where the goal is to win at any cost, even if that means hurting others? We need to start by understanding that a psychopath isn't just some Hollywood villain. They're not always the shadowy figure hiding in the alley. Many of them are charming, intelligent, and even successful. They blend in. But beneath the surface, their moral compass is fundamentally different. And here's the chilling truth: they don't see right and wrong the way we do. For them, the concepts of guilt, remorse, or compassion are foreign. So, what does this say about morality? Is it something we're born with, or is it something we learn? If you strip away empathy, do you lose your humanity? These are the kinds of questions that make this topic so unsettling and so important to explore. Now, let's talk about the mask. Psychopaths are often described as wearing a mask. On the outside, they can be charismatic, even likable. They know how to mimic emotions, how to play the part of a normal person. But that mask is just a tool, a way to manipulate and control the people around them. Beneath it, they're calculating, cold, and detached. This brings us to another question: how much of what we see in others is real, and how much is just a mask?
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound spiritual lesson.
Think about that for a second. Every day we interact with people, friends, co-workers, even strangers, and we assume that what they show us is an honest reflection of who they are. But what if it's not? What if, like the psychopath, they're hiding something darker, something more self-serving? This leads us to a philosophical dilemma. Can we ever truly know someone else's mind? If empathy is the bridge that connects us to others, what happens when that bridge is broken? How do you connect with someone who doesn't feel the way you do, who doesn't see the world the way you do? Psychopaths challenge our very understanding of human connection. They force us to question not just their motives, but our own. You see, most of us operate under the assumption that people are inherently good, that deep down, we all share the same basic sense of right and wrong. But the existence of psychopaths throws a wrench in that belief. It suggests that morality might not be as universal as we'd like to think. Here's something even more profound to consider: what if morality is just a construct? What if it's something we've developed as a society to maintain order, but it's not innate? Psychopaths seem to live outside of this construct, as if they're free from the moral codes that bind the rest of us. Does that make them more evolved or more dangerous? And here's where things get even more complicated. Psychopaths don't necessarily see themselves as the bad guy. In fact, many of them are completely indifferent to the concept of good and bad for them. Life is about survival, power, and control. They do what they need to do to get ahead, without the burden of guilt or shame. Now, think about that for a moment. What would your life be like if you didn't feel guilt or shame? How would that change the way you make decisions, the way you treat others, or the way you see yourself? Would you be more successful, more ruthless, or more lost? This is where the mind of a psychopath becomes a mirror, reflecting back parts of ourselves that we might not want to see. At this point, you might be wondering, is there any hope for a psychopath? Can they change, or are they forever trapped in this mindset? That's a question we'll dive into later, but for now, let's consider this. What does it mean to change if you don't feel remorse? If a person doesn't believe they're doing anything wrong, can they ever truly transform? As we delve deeper into the mind of a psychopath, keep this question in mind: what separates us from them? Is it empathy, morality, or something even more fundamental? And more importantly, what can we learn from understanding their mindset? The moral void: what psychopaths teach us about humanity's darkest corners, or right. Let's continue. We've already started to peel back the layers of the psychopath's mind, but now we're stepping into something even darker: the moral void. Understanding the mind of a psychopath isn't just about examining their lack of empathy or their manipulative tendencies. It's about what their existence reveals about the human condition itself. Let me ask you this: what would a world without morality look like? If psychopaths exist in a moral void, a place where concepts like right and wrong, good and evil, simply don't apply, then what does that say about the nature of morality? Is it something that exists independently, or is it something we've collectively agreed upon to keep society functioning? Psychopaths force us to confront this uncomfortable question. They live without the emotional anchors that guide most of us, without guilt, shame, or remorse. But here's the catch: they often thrive in society. Some psychopaths can become highly successful, even admired, because they exploit the very rules that govern the rest of us. They can rise to power in business, politics, or even in personal relationships because they understand how to play the game without being hindered by conscience. And this leads to a profound realization: morality can be a double-edged sword. While our sense of right and wrong helps build trust and community, it can also be a weakness in a world where not everyone plays by the same rules. Psychopaths exploit that. They know that most people operate under a basic assumption of fairness or decency, and they use that to their advantage. They lie without hesitation, manipulate without remorse, and betray without regret. But here's a deeper question: if psychopaths succeed in a world built on moral codes, does that mean those codes are flawed? Are we too reliant on the idea that people will behave in morally predictable ways? And if psychopaths can thrive within our systems, does that suggest those systems need to be re-examined? This is where the mind of a psychopath becomes a kind of philosophical litmus test. They aren't just outliers, they're revealing something about the fragility of our social contracts. We assume that everyone plays by the same moral rulebook, but psychopaths don't. They show us that morality, while powerful, isn't universal. It's more of a shared agreement, one that can be broken at any time by someone who simply chooses not to care. Now, let's talk about empathy. It's one of the defining traits that psychopaths lack, but it's also the cornerstone of human connection. We feel for others, we imagine their pain as our own. But here's the thing: empathy doesn't always lead to moral behavior. In fact, sometimes empathy can cloud our judgment. Think about it: how often do we make decisions based on emotion rather than logic? We may help someone we love, even if it means bending the rules or hurting someone else. We might forgive someone we empathize with, even if they've done something wrong. Psychopaths, on the other hand, act purely out of self-interest, without the emotional noise. They can make cold, calculated decisions without the burden of caring about others. Here's the disturbing part: sometimes This lack of empathy can be an advantage. In high-stress situations, whether it's running a company, making life or death decisions, or navigating complex social dynamics, psychopaths can remain calm, detached, and focused on their goals. They don't get emotionally overwhelmed, and that can make them incredibly effective in certain contexts. But then we're left with this haunting question: is empathy always a strength, or can it be a weakness? If our emotions sometimes lead us astray, does that mean the psychopath's emotional detachment is, in some twisted way, more rational, or does it strip away something essential about what it means to be human? Psychopaths challenge our assumptions about morality, empathy, and human nature. They exist on the fringes, but their existence forces us to confront the darkest corners of our own minds. They show us that morality isn't as solid as we think, that empathy can be a double-edged sword, and that the human experience is far more complex than we often realize. And so, the question remains: what can we learn from the psychopath's detachment from empathy and morality? Do they represent an extreme version of ourselves, or are they something altogether different, a glimpse into a world where humanity's foundations crumble? The thin line between us, how psychopathy reflects the gray areas of morality now. We're entering a space that might feel uncomfortable, but it's where the true depth of this conversation lies, the thin line between us and them. Psychopaths often feel like they exist on the far edge of humanity, so different from the rest of us that it's easy to see them as other. But the more we explore their minds, the more we begin to realize that the line separating their world from ours might not be as thick as we'd like to believe. Let's face it, we all have moments where empathy fails us. We all have times when we act out of self-interest, when we ignore the suffering of others because it feels inconvenient, or when we manipulate situations intentionally or not to benefit ourselves. In these moments, we might not be psychopaths, but we brush up against some of the same moral blind spots. The difference is that for most of us, these moments are exceptions, not the rule. But it makes you wonder, how thin is that line really? This leads us to an even deeper question: is psychopathy an extreme form of traits we all possess? If we strip away the clinical diagnosis, are psychopaths simply operating at the far end of a spectrum that we all exist on? Consider this: we all have the capacity for self-interest, for emotional detachment, for rationalizing actions that hurt others. So where do we draw the line between normal human behavior and psychopathy? And more importantly, what keeps most of us from crossing that line? One of the key differences, of course, is conscience. For most of us, it's that little voice inside that tells us when we're doing something wrong. It's what makes us feel guilty when we hurt someone, even unintentionally. But here's the thing: how often do we ignore that voice? How often do we find ways to justify our actions, telling ourselves that the ends justify the means, or that we didn't have a choice? In those moments, we're not so different from the psychopath who lacks that inner voice entirely. And this brings us to the heart of the matter: are we all capable of stepping into the moral void? If the right pressures, circumstances, or desires align, could we, too, drift into a space where empathy erodes and self-interest dominates? It's a terrifying thought, but one worth considering. Understanding psychopathy forces us to confront the uncomfortable possibility that morality isn't a fixed trait, it's something we have to actively choose every single day. So, here's a question for you: what's really keeping you on the right side of that line? Is it your conscience, your empathy, or the fear of consequences? And if those things were taken away, if the circumstances shifted, could you be capable of crossing that line too? The choice of morality, navigating the path between darkness and light. As we reach the final part of this exploration, we need to ask ourselves the most crucial question of all: What does it mean to choose morality? By now we've seen that the line between psychopathy and humanity is thinner than we might have imagined. We've understood that empathy, conscience, and morality are not guarantees, they're choices. And this is where everything comes together. But here's the profound truth: morality isn't something we're born with. It's not hardwired into our DNA in an unchanging way. Instead, it's a path we navigate daily, a series of choices that define who we are. For most of us, empathy and conscience act as guiding lights, but they're not foolproof. We've all experienced moments of moral conflict, times when the right choice wasn't clear, or when we ignored our conscience for self-gain. Now, think about the psychopath. They live in darkness, without the lights of empathy or guilt to guide them. But that doesn't mean we're immune to that darkness. We, too, are capable of manipulation, cruelty, and indifference, especially when our desires, fears, or circumstances push us in that direction. The difference is that most of us have the ability to choose a different path. But the critical question is, do we? Here's something to consider: what drives your moral decisions? Is it a deep-rooted sense of empathy for others? Or is it the fear of consequences, whether those consequences are legal, social, or internal, like guilt? Psychopaths teach us that, without certain internal mechanisms, morality can easily become a tool of convenience rather than a genuine guiding principle. But what about us? Are we moral because we care, or because we fear the repercussions of being immoral? This brings us to the heart of the matter. The choice of morality is an active one. Every day we are faced with situations where we can either step toward empathy, compassion, and understanding, or into selfishness, manipulation, and harm. Psychopaths live in a world where the latter is the default, but we don't have to. We can make the conscious choice to stay on the path of empathy, to listen to our conscience, and to act in ways that connect us to others rather than isolate us. So, I'll leave you with this final question: what kind of person do you choose to be when no one is watching? That's the real test of morality. It's not about how you behave when the world is looking, it's about the choices you make in the quiet moments, when it's just you and the weight of your own decisions. And that, my friends, is the chilling truth we all must face.